What happens when one of the most polarizing figures in modern media sits down with television's most unforgiving panel? You won't believe what unfolds when Meghan Markle faces off against The View's hosts in what quickly becomes one of the most explosive confrontations in daytime television history. The Duchess thought she could control the narrative, but she was about to discover that The View's hot topics table isn't Oprah's couch, and these women weren't about to let her off easy. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when royal entitlement meets unfiltered truth. The tension was palpable from the moment Meghan Markle stepped onto the View set last night. Dressed in an elegant cream blazer that seemed carefully chosen to project innocence and sophistication, she settled into the guest chair with that practiced smile we've seen countless times before. But something felt different this time. Maybe it was the way her fingers gripped the armrest just a little too tightly, or how her eyes seemed to scan each host's face as if calculating potential threats. Whatever it was, the audience could sense that this wasn't going to be another softball interview. Whoopi Goldberg opened the segment with her trademark directness, but there was an edge to her voice that regular viewers immediately recognized. So, Meghan, you've been making headlines again with your latest ventures, but there's been some controversy about your approach to certain charitable causes. Can you help us understand what's really going on behind the scenes? The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Meghan's smile flickered for just a fraction of a second before she launched into what sounded like a carefully rehearsed response. Well, Whoopi, I think what people don't understand is how difficult it is to navigate spaces where you're constantly being scrutinized for simply trying to make a positive impact. Harry and I have always been committed to authentic change, not performative gestures. Joy Behar leaned forward, her expression skeptical. But authentic to whom? Because there are reports from former staff members suggesting that your definition of authenticity might be different from what others experienced working with you. The temperature in the studio seemed to drop several degrees. Meghan's composure remained intact, but those watching closely could see the slight tightening around her eyes. I think it's unfortunate when disgruntled former employees choose to speak to the media rather than address concerns directly. It says more about their character than mine. Sarah Haynes jumped in with a seemingly gentler approach, but her words carried their own sting. Speaking of character, there's been ongoing discussion about your relationship with your father and the royal family. Many viewers struggle to understand how someone who speaks so passionately about compassion and unity seems to have such fractured relationships with the people closest to them. Meghan's laugh had a brittle quality that made everyone in the studio uncomfortable. Sarah, I think that's a very reductive way to look at complex family dynamics. When you're dealing with institutional racism and systemic barriers, sometimes the people who should be supporting you are the ones who disappoint you most. Sunny Hostin wasn't buying it. As a former prosecutor, she had a way of cutting through carefully constructed narratives, and she was about to deploy those skills. But Meghan, isn't it convenient that every conflict in your life seems to be everyone else's fault? Your half-sister, your father, palace staff, the British media, even your in-laws. At what point do we acknowledge that the common denominator in all these situations might be you? The question hit like a thunderbolt. For the first time since sitting down, Meghan appeared genuinely rattled. Her practiced media training seemed to momentarily abandon her as she struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't sound defensive. The silence stretched uncomfortably long, filled only by the ambient studio noise and the collective held breath of the audience. I think that's an incredibly unfair characterization, Meghan finally managed, her voice carrying a new edge that hadn't been there moments before. When you're a woman of color entering spaces that weren't designed for you, resistance is inevitable. The fact that some people choose to make that resistance personal rather than addressing the systemic issues places everything about their priorities. Alyssa Farah Griffin, sensing an opening, pressed further. But you've also faced criticism from women of color who feel that you've appropriated struggles that weren't necessarily yours to claim. How do you respond to those voices within your own community? Meghan's mask was beginning to slip. The calculated vulnerability that had served her so well in previous interviews was giving way to something rawer and less appealing. I find it deeply troubling when people try to police someone else's lived experience. My truth is my truth, and no one else gets to determine the validity of what I've endured. The phrase, my truth, seemed to trigger something in Whoopi, who had remained relatively quiet while her co-hosts pressed their guest. See, that's where you lose me, she said, shaking her head slowly. Truth isn't subjective. Either something happened or it didn't. Either you were treated poorly or you weren't. This idea that everyone gets their own version of reality is exactly what's wrong with discourse today. The confrontation was escalating rapidly, and Meghan could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. This wasn't going according to plan. These women weren't nodding sympathetically and accepting her narrative without question. They were challenging her, fact-checking her in real time, and exposing inconsistencies she thought she'd successfully buried. I think what's wrong with discourse today, Meghan shot back, her voice rising slightly, is that people are more interested in tearing down women who are trying to make a difference than actually addressing the problems those women are highlighting. Joy Behar let out a bark of laughter that contained no humor whatsoever. Oh, please, spare us the victim routine. You've made millions of dollars talking about your suffering, while actual victims of the systems you claim to fight against don't have platforms or book deals or Netflix contracts. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Meghan's face flushed, and for a moment, the carefully constructed public persona cracked completely, revealing something much less sympathetic underneath. The audience could sense they were witnessing something unprecedented, a complete dismantling of a celebrity's public image in real time. But this was only the beginning. What happened next would make this exchange look like a gentle warm-up, as the conversation was about to take a turn that would leave everyone in the studio stunned and Meghan Markle facing the most humiliating moment of her post-royal career. The shift in atmosphere was immediate and devastating. Sarah Haynes pulled out her phone with the deliberate slowness of someone about to deliver a killing blow. Actually, Meghan, since you mentioned your truth, let's talk about some facts that have come to light recently. We've obtained audio recordings from former Archwell Foundation staff members that paint a very different picture of your leadership style. Meghan's eyes went wide, the color draining from her face as if someone had just pulled the plug on her. Composure. I'm sorry, what recordings? That's completely inappropriate and likely illegal. Actually, it's not. Sunny Hostin interjected with the precision of someone who knew exactly what legal ground they were standing on. These recordings were made in states with one-party consent laws, during meetings where staff members felt they needed to protect themselves from potential retaliation. The studio fell silent except for the barely audible hum of cameras capturing every micro-expression on Meghan's face. She looked like a deer caught in headlights, her media training completely abandoning her as she scrambled to regain control of a situation that was spiraling beyond her ability to manage. Whoopi leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. Now, we're not going to play the audio out of respect for the privacy of the individuals involved, but we've had our legal team verify the authenticity, and the content is quite revealing about your management approach. This is ambush journalism. Meghan snapped, her voice cracking slightly. I came here in good faith to have a conversation, not to be subjected to some kind of trial based on unverified accusations from people with obvious axes to grind. Joy Behar's eyebrows shot up. Unverified? We just told you our legal team authenticated them. An axis to grind? These are people who worked for your foundation. People who believed in your mission until they experienced your leadership firsthand. Alyssa, Farrah Griffin jumped in, sensing blood in the water. What's particularly troubling is the pattern that emerges. Former palace staff, Hollywood colleagues, Archwell employees, they're all telling remarkably similar stories about your behavior. Behind closed doors, Meghan's composure was deteriorating rapidly. Her hands were shaking now, and she kept glancing toward the exit as if calculating whether she could make a run for it. I don't have to sit here and listen to this character assassination. You're taking the word of disgruntled employees over someone who's dedicated their life to service. Service to whom? Sarah Haynes shot back. Because the people who worked closest with you seem to have a different definition of service than you do. The question hit its mark. Meghan's face flushed red, and for the first time in the interview, her carefully modulated voice rose to something, approaching a shout. How dare you question my commitment to service? I gave up everything, my career, my independence, my privacy, to serve something bigger than myself. You gave up your career. Whoopi's voice dripped with skepticism. Last I checked, you parlayed your royal connections into a multi-million-dollar media empire. That doesn't sound like sacrifice to me. That sounds like the ultimate career move. The accusation landed like a physical blow. Meghan's mouth opened and closed several times as she struggled to find a response that wouldn't make her sound even more tone-deaf. The silence stretched uncomfortably, filled with the ambient noise of a studio holding its collective breath. Sunny Hostin wasn't done. Let's talk about your recent charitable work. There are serious questions being raised about where donor money has actually gone and why so many of your announced initiatives seem to disappear after the initial publicity. That's completely false, Meghan protested, but her voice lacked conviction. We've been transparent about our financial reporting. Have you, though? Joy interrupted. Because investigative journalists have been trying to track the money trail for months, and what they've found is a lot of administrative overhead and very little actual charitable work reaching the communities you claim to serve. Meghan looked genuinely panicked now. This wasn't the type of interview she was used to, where sympathetic hosts allowed her to control the narrative and deflect uncomfortable questions with emotional appeals and victimhood narratives. These women were treating her like any other public figure who needed to be held accountable for their actions and claims. I think this interview is over, Meghan said, starting to remove her microphone. I'm not going to sit here and be attacked based on false information and malicious rumors. False information? Alyssa Farah Griffin's voice rose incredulously. We're talking about documented financial records and authenticated audio recordings. This isn't gossip. These are facts. Meghan's hands were visibly trembling as she fumbled with the microphone pack. Facts according to whom? People who have been trying to destroy my reputation from day one. I should have known better than to expect fair treatment from a show that's built its reputation on tearing down successful women. The irony of her statement wasn't lost on anyone in the studio. Here was someone who had spent years positioning herself as a victim of unfair treatment, now accusing others of the exact same behavior simply because they were asking her to account for her actions. Whoopi's response was swift and devastating. Successful women? Honey, successful women don't leave a trail of broken relationships and burn bridges everywhere they go. Successful women don't have to constantly explain why everyone who gets close to them ends up speaking against them. The words hit Meghan like a slap across the face. For a moment, the mask slipped completely, and viewers could see something raw and ugly beneath the carefully constructed public persona. This wasn't the composed, articulate advocate she presented to the world. This was someone used to getting her way through manipulation and victim playing, and she was completely unprepared for being held accountable by people who weren't impressed by her title or her sob story. You don't know anything about my life or my struggles, Meghan hissed, her voice dripping with venom. You sit here in your comfortable studio, judging people who have actually put themselves on the line for change. Sarah Haynes wasn't backing down. Put yourself on the line? You wrote a book, did some interviews, and started a foundation that seems to exist primarily to fund your lifestyle. Meanwhile, there are people doing real work who don't have platforms to talk about their struggles because they're too busy actually helping people instead of talking about helping people. The studio audience was completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't just a difficult interview. This was a complete dismantling of a carefully constructed public image. And everyone could feel the tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. But what happened next would shock everyone in the studio and cement this confrontation as one of the most explosive moments in daytime television history. Joy Behar reached into her folder and pulled out a thick stack of documents, placing them on the table with deliberate precision. Since we're talking about facts, Meghan, let's discuss some recent court filings that have become public record. Specifically, the lawsuit filed by 3 former Archewell employees alleging workplace harassment and financial improprieties. Meghan's face went completely white. Those are sealed documents. How did you? They're not sealed anymore. Sunny Hostin interrupted with prosecutorial sharpness. The court unsealed them yesterday after your legal team failed to provide adequate justification for keeping them private. And the details are quite illuminating about your management style and how donor funds were actually being used. The transformation in Meghan was immediate and shocking. Gone was any pretense of composure or media training. Her voice rose too. A near shriek as she pointed an accusing finger at the panel. This is a setup. You brought me here under false pretenses to ambush me with illegally obtained information. Whoopi's response was ice cold and devastating. Nothing we've presented is illegal, honey. These are public court records, authenticated audio recordings made legally, and financial documents that your own foundation filed with the IRS. The only thing that's shocking here is how you thought you could keep this information buried forever. Alyssa Farah Griffin opened one of the court documents and began reading. According to the filing, employees allege that you regularly screamed at staff members, threw objects during meetings, and used foundation resources to pay for personal expenses, including your children's private security and your personal shopping trips. That's completely taken out of context. Meghan exploded, jumping to her feet. These people are trying to destroy me because I wouldn't let them turn my foundation into their personal piggy bank. Sarah Haynes looked up from her own set of documents with barely concealed disgust. Your foundation? Meghan, the financial records show that over 60% of donations went to administrative costs and consulting fees, most of which seem to have gone directly to companies owned by you and Harry. The accusation hung in the air like a bomb that had just detonated. Meghan stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, completely unable to formulate a response that wouldn't make her situation worse. Joy Behar pressed the attack. And let's talk about the real kicker. The audio recordings reveal you referring to your donors as useful idiots and laughing about how easy it was to manipulate people's emotions to get them to write checks. I never said that. Meghan screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. You're making this up? This is a coordinated attack designed to destroy everything Harry and I have built. Sunny Hostin held up her phone. Would you like us to play the audio? Because we have it. Right here, authenticated by 3 separate audio forensics experts. The color drained from Meghan's face so completely that for a moment, it looked like she might faint. The studio was dead silent except for the sound of her rapid, panicked breathing. Everyone could see that she was trapped, caught in lies that were impossible to explain away. Whoopi leaned forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. The jig is up, Meghan. We know about the fake charity work, the mistreatment of staff, the financial irregularities, and most importantly, we know about your complete contempt for the people who trusted you with their money and their faith. You don't understand, Meghan whimpered, her voice now small and desperate. The pressure I've been under, the constant scrutiny, the racism, it changes you. It makes you do things you wouldn't normally do. Alyssa Farah Griffin shook her head. In disgust. There it is again. Everything is everyone else's fault. You can't even take responsibility when confronted with documented evidence of your own wrongdoing. Sarah Haynes piled on mercilessly. The most disturbing part is how you've weaponized real issues like racism and mental health to shield yourself from legitimate criticism of your behavior. You've made it harder for actual victims of these problems to be believed. Meghan's response was pure, unfiltered rage. How dare you lecture me about racism? None of you have walked in my shoes or experienced what I've experienced. You have no right to judge me. We're not judging your experiences, Joy Behar shot back. We're judging your actions. And your actions show a pattern of exploitation, manipulation, and complete disregard for the people who trusted you. The final blow came from Whoopi, whose voice carried the weight of moral authority that had made her a television icon. You know what the real tragedy is here, Meghan? You had everything. A platform, resources, public goodwill, the ability to make real change. And you threw it all away because you couldn't resist treating other people like props in your personal drama. Meghan's face contorted with fury and humiliation. She ripped off her remaining microphone equipment and hurled it onto the floor. I don't have to listen to this. You're all just jealous because I had the courage to leave a system that was trying to destroy me. Destroy you? Sunny Hostin's voice dripped with contempt. Honey, you destroyed yourself. We're just reporting on the wreckage. That was the breaking point. Meghan let out a sound that was part scream, part sob, and spun toward the studio exit. This interview is over. You'll be hearing from my lawyers about this character assassination. As she stormed toward the exit, Joy Behar delivered the final devastating blow. Good luck with that legal strategy, considering most of what we discussed. Tonight is going to be evidence in your upcoming court cases. Meghan whirled around one final time. her face twisted with rage and desperation. "You have no idea what you've done. This will destroy innocent people. My children will suffer because of your vindictive reporting." Whoopi's response was swift and final. "The only person responsible for your children's suffering is you, Meghan. You made these choices. You created this situation. And now you have to live with the consequences." With that, Meghan Markle stormed off the View set, leaving behind a studio full of stunned silence and the smoking ruins of her carefully constructed public image. The heavy studio doors slammed shut behind her with a finality that seemed to echo through the building. The hosts sat in momentary silence, processing what had just happened. Finally, Whoopi turned to the camera with the professionalism that had made her a broadcasting legend. "Well, that was certainly something. When we come back, we'll be discussing the importance of accountability in public life and why it matters that we hold public figures responsible for their actions, regardless of their status or platform." As they cut to commercial, the studio remained electric with the aftermath of what everyone knew they had just witnessed: the complete and total destruction of Meghan Markle's public persona, laid bare by her own words and actions. The confrontation had revealed not a victim of circumstance, but someone who had exploited public sympathy while betraying the trust of everyone who had believed in her mission. The View had done what no interviewer had managed to do before. They had stripped away all the carefully constructed narratives and forced Meghan to confront the reality of her own behavior. And in that confrontation, she had revealed exactly who she really was beneath all the polished media appearances and victim narratives. The explosive interview would dominate headlines for weeks, but more importantly, it marked the end of Meghan Markle's ability to control her own story through manipulation and strategic victimhood. The truth, as it always does, had finally caught up with her.